Welcome to the state of Ohio. I'm Joe Ingles, sitting in for Karen Kassler. The General Assembly wrapped up its work this week. Senate President Matt Huffman will be going over to the House in January, where he's expected to serve as the Speaker. Senate Minority Leader Nickie Antonio will stay in the Senate and will work with the likely new Senate President Rob McColley. In this week's State of Ohio, we spoke with both Huffman and Antonio about what they think they've accomplished in this General Assembly. Senate President Huffman, when you were on this show last year, voters had just approved the recreational marijuana law, and lawmakers were considering some changes. The law is in place now. Almost $200 million in sales have happened since non-medical sales were allowed in August. You've advocated for changes, such as limiting home grow. Where does that stand, and why has it taken so long to get some changes on it?
Well, so there was actually a meeting. We had breakfast with the governor, the speaker, and I, maybe 2 or 3 days after the election, and various expressions about there are problems in this initiative. I would say in general that's one of the problems with ballot issues, ballot language, is that they don't go through the vetting process that we have with committees and interested parties and things like that. So this clearly had some drafting errors besides the policy, but with the policy there were things that we think that I think the Senate disagreed with, the governor disagreed with. So we kind of hustled in the first 30 days because that's what the initiative said it would be effective within 30 days. Again, usually it's 90 days before something's effective. We put that together, passed it out of the Senate, and for whatever reasons there are, that's just been disagreement in the House on how to move that. So it hasn't moved. I think we additionally have seen the growth of THC hemp-based products, synthetic or otherwise. I think that needs to be acted on, but isn't going to be. So it's my hope that fairly quickly in the new General Assembly that we'll see action on both of those issues, and that it will likely look like what we did pass last year.
Well, this isn't a legislative issue with Republicans lining up on one side, Democrats lining up on the other. There's, disagreement across the aisle. So what legislative initiative or fix would you like to see done?
To this specifically?
To this specific legislation.
Marijuana legislation. Well, one that, many members of my caucus, actually the majority, supported what we sent out of the Senate over to the House. I think there were some common sense changes in that would really make things better in the long run. And as President Huffman said, often ballot initiatives look at a specific issue, but they don't get into the weeds on how to actually operationalize it. I certainly would like to see some of the changes that we sent over, especially around people that have been convicted of having a small amount of marijuana, and making sure that going forward that their records can be expunged. That was a very important issue for us in my caucus, and it's something that we'll continue to talk about as we continue to talk about the issue, clearly.
Right. Yeah, and are you going to talk about that when you get over to the House?
Yeah, no, I think it's an unresolved issue, and Leader Antonio mentioned a couple of things that were priorities for her caucus that went into the Senate bill that went over, but there's sort of some fundamental things. I think there was language in there about you could not sell a product that was under a certain THC level. Well, they meant over, but it's now the law of the state of Ohio. Yeah. How this money is distributed, the money that we've raised, part of it goes essentially back to the people who are selling the product. And there are a lot of things left out. We know that the cost to poison control centers when you legalize a product like marijuana, that their costs go up tremendously. It happened in Colorado and every place else. And so, very simple. Some of this money should go to poison control centers, and that's not allowed. And I think, as what we did last December is a pretty good template, but it doesn't have to be the only thing we do. As I said, we still have the the hemp-based THC products that are basically unregulated now in the state.
Voters rejected a constitutional amendment in November that would have changed the redistricting process. But Governor DeWine has said he wants to see some changes, such as the Iowa model that he wants to kind of take a look at, have lawmakers take a look at. And a lot of people think that a 65% Republican majority in the House and a 72% Republican majority in the Senate doesn't really represent Ohio. So do you think there will be a redistricting proposal in the next session in both the House and Senate?
I'm sure there'll be a proposal. Someone will have an idea about how to do this better. And you know, back in 2012, when I was running the campaign against the last Democrat-sponsored proposal, you know, I sort of looked around at everybody and said, I think we can do this better, and got together with Vern Sykes, among other folks, and what came out of that were the proposals from 2015 for GA and 2018 for congressional, which were passed pretty overwhelmingly. You can look at in the past in Ohio, back in the late 60s, Republicans came up with a proposal about how to change redistricting. At the time, Democrats were in charge of all the statewide offices and the legislature. And they got signatures and they put it on the ballot. Well, it failed miserably. And then they got together and said, well, why don't we all do this together? Both parties put it on and it passed. And that was what we had through 2014. So one of, and this is, I can give you another several examples through the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. The simple answer is if both parties agree, these things will pass. If one party puts it on, it's going to fail. And that's the history of how these things have gone in the past. So I think there'll be a lot of proposals. Someone said, well, do we want to change this at all? I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are in the current constitutional redistricting process which could and should change. You know, the first one in particular, the GA, you know, we passed that at 2:30 in the morning or some such thing, and you don't always do your best work then. So, you know, I'm happy to look at that. I've talked to Leader Antonio a little bit about the Iowa proposal, but I'll let her give you her own opinion about that. So.
Yeah, let me go to you and ask in addition to talking about the Iowa proposal, you and House Minority Leader Allison Russo, you actually voted for the maps that are in place right now and will be in place until like about 2030. At the time, you, Allison Russo, called the process a sham, and you said the maps that you approved were more fair than the Republican-approved versions that had been under consideration. And both of you kind of indicated that you were leaning toward just letting the voters decide in November. They've decided. So what do you see as the future of this?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that it takes both sides coming together to agree on something. I totally agree with having some kind of a proposal that comes from support on both sides, of partisan sides of this. First of all, it was a very pragmatic vote to agree to the maps, but we also sat down and talked through what those maps would look like. I'm still of the belief that legislators probably shouldn't be doing that because we have definitely a stake in what those maps look like. I have talked to folks in Iowa, actually had the opportunity this summer to speak to some of the folks about the Iowa plan. One of the things that they told me, part of the reason why they believe it works well for them is the fact that baked into their culture within the legislative body is the idea that they will not leave the table until they agree, the legislators. There's a fail-safe in theirs to go to the next level of having it go to the Supreme Court if they can't agree. Just the fact that that's hanging over them has sometimes kept them in the room to try one more time to come to an agreement, because they haven't wanted to use that fail-safe. And so I think what it showed me was we need an Ohio plan. certainly that works for Ohio. I think it's hard to bake in to the culture when our culture is constantly changing because of term limits, what that looks like in the legislature on both sides, both chambers, both sides of the aisle. But I do believe that if there are changes to the plan, ultimately, there's going to have to be agreement across party lines to get it actually done.
But to push back a little bit, the Democrats did agree to it. So, I mean,
To the map.
To the maps, yeah.
Sure. This time. Absolutely, because it was a better map than we had. We participated, absolutely. It was a pragmatic agreement, yes.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about something else here. Universal school vouchers. They're expected to cost around $1 billion. That's more than was estimated initially. Did you expect that?
Well, so in the $1 billion or whatever that number is, I think they're including the autism scholarships, the John Peterson and the Cleveland scholarship, things like that. The actual number, of course, would grow if more people are eligible for that. I would also say that, I think the higher scholarship is in the 8,000 for the high school and 6,000-ish for K to 12, K to 8. And those K to 8, of course, there's twice as many kids. So let's just say on average the voucher's about $7,000, the Ed Choice scholarship. And we've now equalized the Cleveland scholarship and Ed Choice 1 and Ed Choice 2 and all that. Of course, autism and John Peterson are much, much higher than that. I think the way that we should look at this simply is on average for a public school education, it's about $15,000 to $16,000 per student. Now, in my part of the state, that's much lower. It's in $11,000 and $12,000 depending on what. In other parts of the state, it's over $30,000. So, but the average is, so we can look and say, we're saving about $9,000 per student with every child that we say we're going to send you. You can do this, and you can go to a private school. It costs as much less for charter schools also. Now, can it be a dollar for dollar savings? Well, of course not, because schools don't automatically lower their spending by $15,000 if a student walks out the door. But there's the two pillars that this rests on really are educational choice, which is often not made for educational purposes, but for security purposes, for social purposes, for a number of things. But then also it's a savings to the taxpayers. So the $1 billion number, which looks big and scary, well, of course we're spending $12 to $13 billion, and it's much more expensive to send a child to public school on average.
Okay.
So we have to remember that the public school entities are still responsible for transportation for those children to religious-based and charter schools. So that's one. So there is an additional cost that doesn't quite show up there. I think the other thing is that school choice is about a choice that parents make for sure, but then what we have happening right here is that all the taxpayer dollars are put in one pool and then supporting not just public schools but these private school entities. At this point in time, Ohio is definitely a voucher, has embraced the vouchers. However, what we haven't embraced and what I would like and we would like to continue to see is more accountability and transparency. Those are taxpayer dollars. We need to hold them to the same standards that we hold our public schools. That's still not happening. It's something we continue to talk about, and I'm sure next General Assembly will continue to talk about that as well. And I want to make sure that we're never doing this at the expense of reducing any kind of public school funding. And frankly, I would like to see more of our dollars that, I remember when I was a little kid when my parents were weighing whether or not to support the lottery in the state of Ohio. And my mother was very much against gambling, and so she wanted to vote against it. but she understood that those funds were going to go to support public schools. She voted for it because of that factor. Now, there are lottery dollars that do indeed support part of our public schools. The problem is it was just a trade-off of other general fund dollars. And so I think we need to have the conversation about what about expanding the revenues for public schools, for our public school, our education program that includes publics and the vouchers as we go into next year. Because right now, the way that we're balancing the checkbook for local people is by levy campaigns in their local communities. And I don't know how long that people can really continue to support those. It takes its toll on our local communities.
In the last 2 years, lawmakers have passed laws banning gender transition treatment for minors, requiring people to use bathrooms that match the gender on their birth certificates. With the focus on these bills and not other proposals like property taxes or the economy, has it really become too ideological in the legislature?
Well, first of all, I think the key word is focus. And because those are the things that are most talked about by the media and by what we call advocates, the people who are in organizations and are frequenters of the State House, that doesn't mean that it's the focus of the General Assembly. These are the things that people talk about. And, frankly, and I think it's important legislation, but it's not the focus of everything that goes on in the Ohio Senate, and I would say likely in the House either.
I think a lot of it is based on misinformation and a little bit of fear that comes around. As far as us, what's important in the Democratic platform or how we want to move forward, it is those bread and butter issues. It is coming back to, is my community safe? Can I have access to health care? Do I have a job, a good paying job? There's been a lot of work that we have done together in the state of Ohio along with the governor in terms of wonderful opportunities for advancement for jobs and business that have come to Ohio. We will continue to work on those as well as small businesses and their ability to advance and be able to find a place here in Ohio.
Okay. This has been called the least productive legislature General Assembly in least recent history. Is that fair?
Well, I guess it depends on who the counter is, and if the counter wants to say we have to pass a lot of bills, and therefore we can say and bills get signed into government and all of that. I mean, I think one way to look at it is we passed a budget. Everything's been funded. There are some unsolved problems. And, I think the folks who say that, they go, well, in my memory, but there's probably been a lot of legislative bodies or sessions over the past couple of hundred years that were least productive. I'm frustrated that things like the marijuana didn't get passed, and there are other things like that. But I'm an optimistic person, and often my optimism is my downfall. I will tell you that. But I am optimistic that we'll be able to begin quickly to solve a lot of the issues that have pended for the last couple of years.
I want to make a point that you are both here together on this set, talking and doing this interview together. And that's not the case. When the House comes, they will be separate interviews. Yep. Does this mean that, at least in the Senate, that bipartisanship is alive and well, I should say? Does this mean that let me ask that again. Does this mean that bipartisanship is alive and well in the Senate? And what about this constant strife that we seem to see in this political climate?
I'll start. So bipartisanship, working together, I think sometimes it's mistaken for we're supposed to agree on everything. And I believe it means we need to be agreeable and respectful and collegial. And that is certainly what I experience, and I think share with President Huffman, is that we do not agree. I know it's a shocker. We do not agree on everything. However, there is a level of again, respect and also communication. We talk to each other about, we make sure, I mean, it's been a standard for me with any of the leadership that I've worked with over the years in the legislature, both in the House and the Senate. I don't want to ever ambush whoever is in the leadership position, whether it's the Speaker in the House or the President in the Senate, to the best of my ability to make sure that there's information available. But I believe this is how we're supposed to do this. And frankly, I think it's the most productive when we can find common ground. I find common ground with my colleagues. It's how we get legislation passed. It's how we get things we all maybe agree could come out of a bill and make it better and also add to. But it starts with a level of meeting each other at the point of respect for their position. Because ultimately, we both want what, I think we both want the same thing for the state of Ohio and the people in Ohio, is that we make the state the best it can be. We have a little bit of a difference of opinion on how to get there.
I'll let you have the final word here.
Well, that's very well said. I mean, I think Nickie summed it up in a great way, and it really is about professionalism and understanding. And I would add, there's 33 senators. They all got elected by, and each of those districts deserve to be heard. Clearly, there's a majority party, but personally, if I can do something for a member of the legislature on either party, I'm going to do that. It makes the wheels of government move more quickly. And the other part is that most of the things that we do, I'm just talking about in terms of volume, and by most, 80 to 90% of these things are bipartisan. You hear members of a committee get up, a bill gets introduced, the folks on the committee, we accept Democrat amendments and Republican amendments, and both people get up and say, we worked on this bill together and it's a good bill. Well, that's not a very interesting story. Right. If you're walking down the street, and if you're sitting in a park bench and you see two guys walking down the street having a pleasant conversation, not very interesting. If suddenly a fight breaks out, everybody wants to, because that's interesting. And so and I don't expect this to change. People aren't going to suddenly start going, hey, headline, everybody got along well today at the State House. It's just not that interesting. But I think that's the way that it will always be. I've had a great relationship with Senator Leader Antonio, and I think I did also with Leader Yuko in the first 2 years I had. And I think Larry Obhoff certainly did with Kenny also before that. So, I think that collegiality and the other things that Nickie, those are not dead. They're there, and if somebody wants to look for them, they'll find them.